This review is going to include a first and a last. The new item that we're going to be including in this review is the Sword Agility Graph. This is the graph that has been developed and created by Vincent Le Chevalier and Peter Johnson as kind of one of the things that was introduced in the Klingen Museum exhibition and in the book The Sword, Form and Thought. So I'll be including that in this review in the functionality section to speak to my thoughts on the sword and how it handles and have the quantifiable information for that. But one of the things that's also going to be a last for these videos is actually the background here, the setting, because this is the last video I will be doing in my old house. We are preparing to move, and I will have to find a new place to do these types of videos, which means a whole new background. So hopefully it'll be a better location and better videos. Now, on to this review. I'm really excited for it because, well, this was my birthday present. And today, we're going to talk about the Castille Armory Custom Fader. Castille Armory provides a wide range of blade types that can be used as a base model for custom sword designs. Their swords are designed to work for both HEMA as well as the SCA, and they cater the implementation of these swords to their particular roles. The hilt of this particular custom fader is based in part on the Albion Gallo Glass. My wife knows that the Gallo Glass is absolutely my favorite sword, and so she asked Castille Armory to build it based partially on that so I could take my Gallo Glass, at least in spirit, into the HEMA tournament scene. This sword uses Castille Armory's standard fader blade, which is made of 5160 steel. The cross includes the Gallo Glass's signature quatrefoil cutouts, and while the pommel is a ring pommel, it is a little bit different. This also includes a standard nut so that the entire sword can be disassembled for either blade replacement or tightening of the entire hilt assembly. The blade has a 3mm rolled edge and a nice wide blunted tip for safe sparring. Here are the specifications of this specific Castille Armory custom fader. In my past reviews of faders, I've spoken a lot about how functionality for a fader is so much more important than aesthetics, because these are meant to be workhorses. These are meant to be used as a tool in tournaments, in sparring, and they're going to be abused, and it really doesn't matter how pretty it looks. However, this is actually one of those cases where I would then digress from that stance and from that opinion, and here's why. The HEMA scene has a lot of lack of individuality. What I mean is the armor we wear, i.e. the padded jackets and the fencing masks and the knee protection and the leggings and all these things, they all look very similar. We're all just dressed in black. It's almost no different than how modern sport fencing is all in white, and there's very little difference in individuality. And HEMA practitioners have found ways to actually stand out so you can tell people in a tournament who is who and who's fighting. One of the ways they do this is painting their masks, and while not every tournament will necessarily allow that, as well as not everyone always likes to face an opponent with a painted mask, most people have gotten to the point where they're comfortable with having painted masks simply because it helps you recognize who the person is fighting. One of the other ways people have actually found to do this, besides finding really interesting socks to wear, is getting an interesting custom fader. So this helps them stand out. I saw this when I was at Long Point. There was a custom fader. It was actually a Castille fader that was designed to look like a Scottish claymore. I have seen them to have very decorative hilt components in order to make it stand out and not just be yet another Reginier or just another kind of standard workhorse fader. All that said, though, there is a trade-off that comes, as I'll speak to in the functionality section, with having the aesthetics, because there is going to be a significant impact. But Castille did a really good job of balancing those things. So what you end up with is a very good functional sword, but in this case what's really important is the aesthetics. Now, the blade is pretty standard. It is their standard fader blade. It looks nice enough. The shield is very, very kind of straightforward. There's not a lot of frills with that, and it's actually quite narrow, so it's not super wide, and I'm okay with that. The implementation of the blade is really good, and the polishing job they did on it is really beautiful. Now, at this point, I have used a sword, so I've actually marred up the blade a little bit in actual sparring use. But they did just such a beautiful job on the polish, and it gets this really interesting effect to it when you use to catch it in the light just right. The crossguard is probably the most gallo glass aspect of this particular custom fader. They didn't get all the details exactly right, but they got a lot of them very close. There are certainly some things that are Castille's own kind of twist on the design, but it really ends up just paying good homage to the beautiful work that Albion did. And this makes it really great because now I get to feel like I'm using the sword that I really want to use, but in a way that I can't use my gallo glass. And they just did a really good job implementing it. It looks really beautiful. They captured the design, the clean quality of it very, very well. The handle is also very nice. The wrapping job is extremely well done. They have some reinforced wrapping at both right up against the cross as well as right up against the pommel. You can actually see bits of it that are actually coming off now, even just with some basic use. But that's to kind of to be expected. This is to give it just a little bit of extra protection as you use it, because you will wear it out very quickly in using it in sparring. And the handle is really good, nice and wide, but I think they did a really good job of getting a nice even wrap on it, and it just looks really beautiful. Now, where it differs a lot from the Albion gallo glass in terms of implementation is actually at the pommel. It looks a little bit different in a couple of regards. One is it is missing the obvious peen block, because this is not a peened pommel. It is, in fact, as you can see, it is a nut pommel. Of course, that makes sense from a functionality standpoint, as I'll talk about in a moment. But the other thing that really makes this look a little bit different is actually the tang itself, which of course is designed to take that nut pommel and is actually rounded, whereas Albion actually has a kind of rectangular flattened part of the pommel, of the tang that comes through the pommel. What's interesting about this is the rounded tang is actually, I've seen rounded tangs in some actual museum examples of Irish ring pommel swords, so it works. It acts very much as that nod to Irish heritage, as well as to the gallo glass. All in all, the implementation of this fader is just gorgeous. They did an amazing job. A lot of thought and time went into this. And I have to say that from an aesthetic standpoint, Castille knows what they're doing. They know how to implement a really beautiful sword, put it all together in a really nice package. And the fact that they can really execute on almost any design you would want is a big draw, in my opinion. So if you're looking for that kind of custom fader look, Castille, I think, may have the market cornered in that regard. Now, of course, what good is a fader without it being purely functional? And I'm going to have a lot to say about the functionality of this particular fader, because I actually had a chance to use it a lot recently when I was doing the Team Georgia meet, where we were practicing and sparring quite a good bit. Now, I've put this fader through its paces, and I have to say it really has held up very nicely, especially for a fader that is designed with a nut pommel. It did get loose, but tightening it was extremely easy with just a really basic ratchet set. And the blade has held up really well. There are a couple of nicks now that I've managed to put on the blade, but nothing real severe, and it held up extremely well. So overall, from a functionality standpoint, the overall construction is exactly what you would want. And I have to admit that this is beginning to actually make me change my opinion on faders, specifically, the concept of a nut pommel versus a peened pommel. And actually here's why, because if you're going to spend a lot of the money on getting a custom fader that is going to have this nice hilt component, it would be a shame to have it break or the blade need to be replaced, and you kind of have to discard the whole sword. So having the blade be replaceable is kind of nice, as well as the fact that as you use it, if it ever does get loose, it's trivial to re-tighten. So I've actually kind of changed my opinion a bit since some of my other videos on faders, because I still think peens are probably going to be the most sturdy, but when you have certain instances where a nut pommel makes sense, then it's almost more of an advantage at that point from a functionality standpoint, from a utilitarian standpoint. Other kind of notes about the functionality of this sword: the grip is actually just the right size for me. Some people might find it a little bit overly wide. I actually don't mind that, because when you're wearing, especially when you're wearing gloves in HEMA, you find that you want a slightly larger handle to be able to grip on. A lot of the gloves tend to resist having a fully closed fist, and so having a nice wide handle can actually be pretty helpful. The guard serves really well. I used it in a couple of different winding and binding exercises, and it performed like you'd want it to. A couple of notes, one being the pommel here. Because it is a nut pommel, the pommel itself can actually twist. You can see I'm actually twisting that. Now it's off, right? It is actually separate from the tang. In fact, you could just keep rotating this and it wouldn't loosen any of the hilt components. Very much this pommel is decorative. It serves its purpose a little bit from a counterweight perspective, which I'll get to in a moment. But it certainly is not part of the overall construction of the rest of the sword. It almost just sits on there as an appendage. I think at first I wasn't sure how I felt about that, because I could feel it move, especially if I moved my hand down to the pommel at any point. I could feel it shift. I wasn't sure how happy I was about that, but on second thought, after using it some, I actually much prefer that, because it means that if something does twist, I'm not loosening my entire hilt component by accident all of a sudden. So a lot of thought went into how they were going to implement this, and I think that's really awesome, because from a custom fader design, it'd be very easy for someone manufacturing this to not think about some of the ins and outs of usage, and I think that probably just comes with experience. Castille has a lot of experience in building these kinds of swords, and I think they've learned probably a lot of lessons by the time they've gotten to my particular fader. Now, some of the things that I will note about the functionality has a lot more to do with the sword's agility, specifically with what happens because of the pommel. And that's because this is a much lighter pommel than would probably be seen on most other Castille faders, which actually means that their balance point, it's actually really far away from the shield. It's right about here. Now, that's actually not too bad for just kind of a standard long sword, to have that kind of 4 to, as this is more like 5 or maybe even 6 inches out. But because of the lack of the weight as a counterbalance, it pulls that center of mass a little bit further away from the hilt, and that does have an impact on its agility. And so looking at the agility graph for this sword, you can actually see that it is actually quite agile in terms of blade movement. I actually found that this particular fader works really well in cutting, which means as I try to move the blade around, winding and binding, breaking away from a bind and trying to get a cut either around someone's sword or doing something fancy like a Zwerkow, it worked actually extremely well. But one of the disadvantages that this brings is that the pivot point is actually fairly far away from the tip of the blade. What I found this actually means from my experience with it is that it's actually very hard to get some good point control. So moving into a thrust during a bind is actually a little bit challenging, because you have to overcompensate with the movement of the hilt in order to get the point where you really want it. It took me a while to actually decide on how I wanted to word that, because I wasn't really quite sure how I wanted to say that. And it actually was, fascinatingly, along with this sword graph, that I was able to think about what that actually meant. And I was able to put to words what I could only really say, well, it just feels okay except for this one little aspect. Now, that's a very minor gripe, especially because using mostly German longsword traditions, thrusting is important, but I spend probably a lot more time doing cuts at an opponent. And it certainly also bears that this is actually a fairly long fader blade. It isn't quite as long as the Reginier fader that I have, but it's certainly longer than most longswords, actual longswords, would be in terms of blade length. And so getting it into a thrust anyway when you're close to your opponent really isn't necessarily always an option. So it is unfortunate that there is a little bit of a trade-off to get the visual aesthetics of this sword, that now you are getting a little bit of a catch in the functionality, but honestly, it's so small a difference that I barely even noticed it, and it really wasn't until we did a very particular exercise in that group meet that I was having trouble getting thrusts in on my opponent, and I decided that really had to be why, is because I couldn't quite get the tip placement exactly where I wanted it. Now, I imagine that's just more time spent with the fader will actually fix that, But yes, I'm extremely happy with this fader. There isn't really an aspect of the functionality to it that I thought was just a complete game breaker. And in the end, I was extremely happy with it. I was a little bit cautious. I wasn't quite sure how I'd feel about certain aspects, but I'm very confident to say this is an extremely good fader. Of course, Castille makes sure that their faders are actually rated for whatever you are actually participating in. So they actually have different fader blades for whether or not you're doing SCA or you're doing HEMA. And of course, this is a HEMA implemented blade, so it has the correct kind of bend near the tip for HEMA, and it has the right hardness, and it takes into account the use of the sword beyond just the general design. So yet another bit of thought that's being put into it by Castille Armory. And because this is designed for HEMA, it holds up to the beatings, and I could not be more pleased with the job they did. I'm really ecstatic about how much fun this is to use, how awesome I feel holding it in my hand, and certainly while there are a few minor things, namely the slightly poorer point control, and also while I do like these wrappings up near the hilt and near the pommel, they do come off, and so you have to spend some time doing some basic maintenance. But there's such small gripes that I really have almost nothing bad to say on a functionality standpoint for this sword. Drawing this review to a close, I have to say I wasn't quite sure how I'd feel, but at the end of the day, I would highly recommend Castille Armory for custom sword work in terms of blunts and things for utilization in HEMA. I don't have a lot of experience with the sharps or any type of standard swords they make. I think their main focus really is on those kind of blunt and reenactment style swords. And I think that bears out that they have such a wealth of options. If you go to their website, they've got just an absolute huge amount of different blade types, profiles, and options on how you can actually construct a sword, and they work with you, which is really awesome. They do fantastic work. Visually, it's very hard to find such nice, clean work done in swords, and while there are some noticeable gaps in things such as hilt components, it's not a huge deal because of how this is constructed and the purpose behind a lot of it. And certainly the implementation overall, they put a lot of care into the implementation of their blade. So aesthetically, it's beautiful. From a functionality standpoint, again, it does exactly what it's meant to do. It works exactly how it's meant to work. They did a great job. It holds up really well. Castille knows what they're doing. This is my first real experience with Castille. I have handled a couple of their faders in the past, but never with enough time to really make a decision on how I felt about it. But if you are looking for a custom fader design especially, but really I think for any custom sword, Castille might be a good place to go. It does come at a cost. I don't actually know what the cost of this sword is. It's a gift, I don't ask. But their prices do vary pretty broadly in terms of range, because every little thing you're going to do is going to add some cost to it. But the fact they're willing to work with their customers so closely to get them exactly what they would want is really just awesome. And the fact that they can predict a lot of the issues that people might see is also really awesome. So it speaks volumes to them as a company that they know kind of predictively what the customer is really going to need before the customer needs it. And that means a lot, in my opinion, coming from me, because I have enough swords, and I usually feel like I know exactly what I'm looking for, that when I feel like, oh, I'm not sure how I feel about this nut pommel over here, no, it actually completely changes my opinion on it because of how it's implemented and the trade-off between having a peened and the loss of the entire beautiful custom hilt if you do something like damage your blade. So I have to say, Castille has really impressed me on this sword, and you should definitely go check out their website, go see some of the cool things that they have made. They do beautiful custom work, and at this point I don't think I could recommend them more highly, really. Again, there are a couple of minor, very nitpicky things with this fader, but they are very minor, And so, yeah, I could not be more happy with this fader. This is the Castille Armory custom fader, designed specifically for me by my wife and by Castille Armory. I give this fader a 4.5 out of 5, and I feel that you would be very happy with any product that you got custom from Castille. I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. You can also check out Medieval Review on Patreon.